Alright, so for the next original versus remake, I wanted to talk about the House on Sorority Row with its 2009 remake of partially the same name. And what's interesting, first of all, is that these came out at two completely different times for slasher movies. Where the House on Sorority Row kind of came out when they were really, really thriving, when, Halloween and Friday the 13th and all that stuff had made everything really popular at this point, and it's the thing that people really flocked to. They were like the superhero movies of their day, and it just seemed like it was going to be this endless trend. And Sorority Row was coming out at a time where the slasher movie didn't really have that kind of attraction, and it really didn't kind of have that respect. I vividly remember when it was coming out, it was one of those movies where every time you went to a horror movie, or sometimes maybe even not just horror movies, this trailer was on everything. And this trailer, I remember, despite how many times it played, only really got two reactions. And that was either not really a reaction at all, or laughing when the trailer was over. And not in the, oh my god, that would be fun kind of laugh. It was like a bad laugh. It was easy to predict that it did not take off the way that it did. And it basically, slashers at this point were just, remakes or reboots or whatever, because I think the other two that come to mind for 2009 were, at the beginning of the year, we'd had the Friday the 13th reboot, which is the last Friday the 13th movie we've had, and Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 towards the end of October, and we know how that went. So, slashers were just not in a good place. And it's kind of easy to see why when you look at the approach being taken here. Because, interestingly enough, and I've talked about this so many times, but when you look at the old slashers, despite their what a slasher movie is, it was surprising how I don't exactly want to say there was a lot of humanity in them, but they focused enough on the characters for a while before the slashing would start in a lot of the old slasher movies, especially in that 80s era. And so when we get scenes at the beginning of the House on Sorority Row, when we go around the circle and we meet all the characters, and it just lays the groundwork for who the characters are, and kind of setting up who the final girl will be, who's the person that's the most likely to get killed off, who's the one that's kind of the troublemaker of the group and stuff like that. Um, when this one is setting the characters up, it sets up pretty early that Katie's going to be our final girl. I don't know if the whole concept used to be it was kind of you just had to watch and see who the final girl was going to be, but I feel like in most cases you can point out pretty quickly who the final girl is going to be. Even if it's a more of a mystery when it's kind of a no-name cast. So looking at Katie here as this sort of strong final girl, where she has this sort of integrity to her, and she makes her voice heard really early. She slaps Vicky when Vicky really needs it. All of this happens relatively early, and they set her up as a relatively strong character amongst the group. As far as having a final girl for the remake, first of all, I guess it's a bit of an interesting turn that there's more than one final girl in the remake, it turns out, with Brianna Evigan and Rumor Willis. I don't really count the sister because she's barely a character at all. She's basically, she has two scenes where she's this ridiculous red herring, and then it's oh no, actually she gets to do the slow walk with them, which I've never understood why. But as far as Brianna Evigan being kind of the main final girl, she's just kind of there the whole time. The interesting thing about when you look at the groups of characters, when you look at the House on Sorority Row, another thing that makes Katie stand out is that she's kind of just the only one that stands out, with the exception of maybe Vicky, because Vicky's the big personality. Vicky's the one that sets everything off and gets them all into trouble. So Katie's is the most memorable of them besides Vicky, even though we know Vicky is destined for death by the setup. It's the opposite for the remake, where every other character is a really big personality, and Brianna Evigan is just kind of stuck with nothing. Nothing at all. Obviously she's got the boyfriend that ends up being the killer, but that's basically her only place in the story, despite kind of supposedly being the center of it. So that's really clumsily done. As far as the house mother, where we have Slater in the original movie, who does die quite early, but is still a constant presence in it because number one, there's always the case of where her body is or whatever. But there's also this implication the movie wants to put on us, which is could she also be the killer, and that kind of becomes a bit of a mystery of it. I like the turning on its head of that and the turning on expectations of that, where we have this moment where Carrie Fisher goes like full shotgun mode and actually takes up for them and wants to defend them and protect them, which is pretty much the opposite of what Slater is in the original movie. So that's kind of nice. But that's like one of maybe two compliments I can give the remake. But there's actually another one here where there's something that I feel like I prefer in the remake, but it's kind of complicated because I've got to talk about the House on Sorority Row and its misdirection. I got to go down this rabbit hole in hopes that I don't confuse myself, let alone confuse whoever happens to be watching this. Um, the thing about Sorority Row, the remake, is that it takes the slasher approach on paper, like the really classic slasher approach that we love. The reasons that we love slasher movies or that we recognize as slasher movie tropes in a good way, where it takes us back to that place where slashers were really thriving. And so we've got, like a medicine cabinet jump scare. We've got, showers of nudity for no reason. There's the mystery element. That's the thing that sticks out to me the most and I think that's the appeal to a lot of slasher movies is that they take a mystery element, that there's this, you have to figure out who's doing the killing and why. And that's something that I feel like kind of gets left behind when people bring up slashers now, where they just say, "Oh, it's just people being slaughtered," which is true. But I feel like at least for people like me, I guess that mystery element is something that always keeps me coming back to slasher movies and why I think I love them so much. At least a big part of it. Um, so yeah, it does throw in those laughable red herrings, but the way they treat Garrett especially is so fucking sloppy. It might be the sloppiest way I've ever seen a red herring treated, where that he's after the opening he's completely off screen for the rest of the time, except for this very last minute moment where he pops back up and he's like slit his wrists and he's like freaking out, and then they smack him with the car and he may or may not be the cliffhanger ending. That's I don't know what the idea was behind treating this character that way, and actually thinking the audience would think it's him. I don't know, but talking about the way a mystery is treated in the original movie, this is where I get a little lost. So we do start off with our classic slasher opening, where there's this scene that happens that's seemingly unrelated to anything else. So for as you're piecing together the mystery throughout the movie, you have to keep asking yourself, okay, how does this possibly connect to that opening scene? And it does. Apparently, there was a longer version of the opening scene where obviously the implication is that the baby dies, like shortly after the delivery or during the delivery or something. And then I guess there was an extended scene where she like has the baby wrapped up and she puts it in the pool. And that was the opening scene to really, really imply that the baby died. But they cut that part out. But I feel like there's still enough implication there, just hearing Slater scream from the distance. So they set that up as this big sort of misdirection thing. And so what it appears to be doing now is that because the audience thinks the baby is dead, basically the whole movie we're supposed to think that Slater is not actually dead and she's the one that's killing them. And they really, really lean into that. So with that in mind, there's a lot of stuff here where I feel like things are contradicted. And I remember the first time I saw this movie and I wasn't really sure, I just kind of wasn't sure what to think. I think for the most part I was under the impression it would have just been a third party character. It wouldn't have been that the baby lived and grew up, and it wouldn't have been Slater. It would have been somebody else entirely. But we've basically narrowed it down to two possibilities for most of the movie. And so there's things here where we're building up that Slater is apparently, we learn through dialogue, becoming increasingly unhinged. And this is kind of enforced by this moment, this other sort of misdirection moment, when we're at the doctor's office and we're looking at an X-ray of a skull, and they're talking about this patient who they don't say explicitly who they're talking about. They just say that there is a character that has a condition, and it seems to be leaning in Slater's direction. And so they're saying, like, any, traumatic experience can, amplify the violent tendencies of this patient. And so it's like, okay, yeah, that explains that Slater is becoming increasingly unhinged. Maybe, like, when she was giving... They talk about the birth, so it's like, maybe when she was giving birth, something happened. And that's how she's been unhinged at this point. On top of the fact of, in quotes, losing her baby. There's even that moment when she's walking into the doctor's office at the beginning, and there's that mother and child there, and she, like, kind of stares them down with resentment. And it's like, at first we think, like, oh, this mother has what she could never have, but then it's the whole, she just has a normal child. And that could be where the resentment comes from, or this is what I could have had, or something like that. But then, when she goes into the doctor's office in this scene at the beginning, the doctor says his condition has worsened, which seems to tell us right up front. Now, maybe it's something about, we're supposed to think he's talking about some other patient or something, but I mean, he's talking to Slater, and that seems to be a pretty clear reveal that the child she had is still alive. And so we have the scene when she, like, goes up into the attic, and she talks about, like, I'm gonna live my life the way I want to. And so we see all of, like, these children's toys and stuff like that, but she just sort of sits in the attic. There's no indication that there's anybody else up here. And she says the line at the doctor's office, nobody else is going to be at the house, and it's closing. And so, yeah, now that we know what's going on, we can take that as a double meaning of, at first we're supposed to take it as, nobody will be in the house except me, when it's actually, nobody will be in the house except us. So there, you can see the way they use that, but then there's other stuff in here, like the way they use suspense with the pool specifically, when we know Slater's body is in it, and then this party happens. And so the idea, it's sort of like turns into a rope kind of thing, where, like, there's a party going on, and there's a dead body here that only a select few people at this party know about. So we get scenes like when guys start circling the pool, or they start to, throw somebody in the pool or whatever. And it seems like the movie's trying to get suspense there from, oh no, somebody's going to discover the body. But the killings and a killer running around has already started by this point, so that kind of, if we're supposed to think the killer's Slater, that kind of contradicts any pool-related suspense. So it all seems kind of messy and contradictory of what we as the audience were intended to think, because I think I've heard the director say, I've heard Mark Rossman say that the point is that you think the baby's dead, you think the killer's Slater, is what the whole concept they were going for is. So yeah, as far as there being a mystery angle to it, it's all just a little too jumbled to really get that that feeling. So like I said, unless you get under the impression that there's a third party that's killing everybody, then there's kind of a mystery element. But otherwise, it feels like it's straightforward to a fault about what's going on here, and how pretty, if you think simply enough, it's all kind of just right there. So, and maybe that's the twist, is that people don't think simply, they're trying to overthink who the killer might be, and when you start to overthink, and it's just the simplest possibility, which is an approach we've seen slashers take before. Scream took that approach with Billy, but that's... So yeah, I really like the mystery element, so that's something that's always kind of been lacking for me for The House on Sorority Row as far as classic slashers go, and why it's never really been at the top of my list of slashers, is it kind of treats the mystery element pretty sloppily, if it's really much trying to use it at all. But going back to, like, the characters that we have, and introducing the actual mystery element that's in the remake of it's just one of the characters, and they're not really trying to push us in a specific direction, with the exception of Garrett, who, like I said, is the sloppiest red herring of all time. But that's so blatantly obvious. You are looking for another killer, and you're pretty much like this. I'll just say it up front. This movie doesn't seem smart enough to go the route of setting up Garrett so much that it actually does end up becoming him. This movie doesn't think that much. So when you look at the other characters, I was talking about how when you go around the circle in the house on Sorority Row and you meet the characters, and it's like, and Rossman said when he was putting this together, it was from his experiences at like fraternities and sorority houses and stuff like that in college in general, and that's where a lot of his dialogue came from. And when you're thinking of like, you know, 80s teenagers, that probably seems about right. In 2009, we were at a time though where every single line had to be like an edgy zinger or something, or each character like trying really really hard to be memorable. Like I said, I mean, they're more memorable characters than in the original movie, but maybe that's not necessarily a good thing when these are the characters. Especially, there's one girl especially, Chugs, and you know she's gonna be just, she's gonna come off like a real human being. She's in a college movie in 2009, and her name is Chugs. And this, obviously, the opening scene, it's kind of an impressive opening where they make it look like it's one continuous shot. But yeah, it's one of those, you know, college parties where they're having pillow fights, and there's strobe lights, and there's cake, and it's basically a near orgy. So it's a music video college, essentially. And so, yes, it makes sense that there's a girl here named Chugs. But with Chugs, we get stuff like they're sitting around in the circle, and while we have these normal interactions in the original movie, in the remake, Chugs says stuff like, I boned your dad, and she means it. And the characters kind of barely react to this, but it's clear Chugs is dead serious about this, and we kind of get that vibe with her character as we go on. Somebody is in need of mouth-to-mouth, and so when one girl gives another girl mouth-to-mouth, Chugs is there to say, that's so hot. Chugs also talks about the great experiences she's had with roofie sex, as they call it. So there's that. She says, my brother's good in bed. And these are not only... Okay, so it's one thing that she says things like, my brother's good in bed. It's another thing that this is like really, really, really sloppy and blatant exposition too. That's how they basically set up the her brother situation. And so... that it's like I said, a really bad and blatant exposition is one thing. But to make your characters insufferable it's not just that they're giving exposition, it's everything in between is just wrong here. So basically, what the short version of all of this is thank God Chugs is like one of the first to go. So, and Chugs basically the reason I'm calling her out specifically is she's basically a representation of what most of the characters are like. Or like I said, everybody's just trying to get their one-liner in. And because of this, there's no genuine fear or anxiety or anything when the situation takes off. The situation takes off in like the first 10 minutes when they accidentally kill Megan, I think her name is. Well, they accidentally put her in the situation where she's killed by Garrett. So, in this point, we get lines like, Jessica is setting herself up as the Vicky of the group, where she's the one that's kind of the troublemaker, she's the one that's kind of the self-appointed leader, but you're also just sort of, you know for a fact that she's gonna die at some point because she just has it coming as far as slasher movie standards go. So, when you're looking at it, you look at this situation and you see Megan get killed and they cover up the body, and that's the other thing too, is not just slasher movies, but this idea of the body disposal, keeping a secret thing, the I know what you did last summer thing. There's something to that old storyline that's also always, you know, intriguing and feels kind of old-fashioned, and has that sort of kind of appeal. But then we get lines like, do you know what it's like to live with a secret like this? And Jessica says, of course we do, we're Theta Pi. Now, I don't really know what that means. Unless it's like this really clumsy reference to the original movie, but if that's the case, that only furthers this problem that none of these people act like real people. And I'm not saying that movies have to be 100% real life. I despise that way of thinking. But like I said, if you want some kind of fear or anxiety to come through and transfer from the characters to the audience, they have to have some kind of grounded in reality reaction to what's going on here, instead of everybody trying to get their one-liner in, which is what the entire fucking script is the everybody trying for, their funny line or whatever, or their memorable quote or whatever it would be. And that's really, it kind of ends up being one of the many deaths of this movie. Then it's actually even more jarring when Jessica actually does manage to eke out a couple of funny lines, and a couple of funny moments happen back to back. When like after Mickey's been pulled into the wall and killed, and just his legs are sticking out, and they find the body, and Jessica says, "That's Mickey. I'd know those ugly ass shoes anywhere." And it's weird to me that that line is genuinely funny. Because that's like one of the things that really doesn't work about this movie is everybody speaking like that. Then there's a funny moment directly after that when they say they're getting like texts from Garrett or something, or who they think is Garrett, and they say I think it's the video of Megan being killed, and they say, "We can't let Rumor Willis see this; she'll freak out." And then we just hear a scream in the way distance, and they're like, "Oh shit, it's too late." And it's like these moments that are it's even weirder and more out of place when it actually is funny, weirdly enough. So that's just right away where it was all falling apart, is just with the characters alone. Um, I guess we can talk about the creepy factor first, or any kind of scary factor there might be. As far as the original movie, it does have much more creepy moments, for sure. There's the whole, like, just in general, when we see Slater sitting in the attic, just something, even if we're not really sure what's going on with Slater, if we're sure if she's going to be the killer or not, just something about the atmosphere of this attic is so fucking creepy in this really effective way. There's also when Katie's been drugged by the doctor towards the end, and she's having like those ghostly visions. That gets really trippy and really creepy in this really fun way. And talking about the doctor and getting drugged by him, that idea of the age-old thing in movies like this, where you have that person that you think is trustworthy, where like it's like everything has happened and we're ramping up to the climax, and you think you've seen the worst of it, and then you think you've finally found help, you've found this sort of sanctuary, and then the person that you think is going to help you ends up being part of the problem, and ends up getting you worse down the rabbit hole of horror. And so the doctor kind of being that here for Katie is effective in that sense. And then, of course, the killer reveal in itself. Maybe one of the creepiest killer reveals ever. Not the first time we see him. Where it's the first time we see him and he looks up at her. And it looks like he's wearing a grotesque mask. But I'm assuming those are the abnormalities we've heard about with this character. And so it's the second reveal of him, though, where it's like, what they do that's so effective here is we think that's the scary reveal, is that we see the grotesquerie of his face and all that. How he looks like practically inhuman. And then how startling that is. And so that's one thing. But when she's hiding in the attic and we see the Jack-in-the-Box clown sitting there, and it looks like a doll, and we've seen it before. We got a shot earlier. I think it was the scene where Slater was in the attic. We got a shot of it earlier, so it's been established that it just looks like it's sitting there, and we, the audience, think it's a doll. And so when Katie is hiding in the attic, and we're under the impression that he's somewhere else at this point, and then we see the clown start to move and sit up, that is like an all-time horror movie moment right there. And so obviously nothing like that is going to be found in the remake whatsoever. The only thing I can think of that I would even consider creepy in the remake is the scene when they're at the graduation party and Jessica's giving like her speech, and then Brianna Evans starts to think she sees Megan coming through the crowd. And then that just ends up being the sister reveal, which goes in a lot of stupid directions. But there's that one moment, though, where we're building up to that I feel like is genuinely creepy, the way they handled it. But actually, it's not just the fact that the sister's this ridiculously overemphasized red herring that kills this creepy moment. What kills the creepy moment is when she still thinks it's Megan and she faints. And when she faints, it's that stock sound effect of a crowd gasping that you that you hear everywhere. And that's just an embarrassing move on this movie's part. And like I said, that's like the only creepy scene they had. There's one interesting scene where I'm not really sure how to take it because I kind of like what they did, but I also don't like what they did. And it's I think it's Mickey again. The scene where he's walking around and there's things covered in sheets, and so it's clear where the suspense is going to come from here. Where it's like he's gonna, look under the sheets, and under one of these sheets is probably going to be the killer. The question is, how long is he going to look under sheets before the killer pounces? And they could really drag this out and make it super suspenseful. Even if it's been done before, still, it's sometimes, a suspenseful trope will still get suspense out of it because it's just inherently there. But it happens immediately. The first sheet he checks under, he gets attacked by the killer. And like I said, I'm not sure how I feel about that because it means there's no suspense in the scene at all. But at the same time, it did turn that trope on its head, and you are expecting the scene to go on longer, and it happens immediately. So there is merit to that scare, but I'm still just not sure if I would have preferred more suspense. It's kind of hard to say. But the problem with the movie, though, as far as how it handles itself, visually trying to instill some, anxiety in the audience or something, so much of this movie is in like handheld camera work and close-ups, oftentimes for no reason at all. Like obviously during the intense scenes like Megan's death scene or something, okay, I guess, but like it's disorienting in a certain way and puts you at unease in a certain way. Maybe gives you a little bit of motion sickness, and that kind of works its way and makes you feel like the motion sickness is just anxiety. It tricks you into thinking that or something. Maybe. But there's also a lot of scenes in this movie that are just normal dialogue scenes. Just people having regular conversation and will be in close-up with handheld camera work. And it's like, what the fuck is this? Like, what? Like, why would you want the movie to look like this all the time? And if it's supposed to be that constant feeling of unease, it's not working. It just looks like really shitty amateur hour camera work, and is not doing the movie any favors whatsoever. So I think they were trying to get some unease out of the audience with that, but it's just really embarrassing and an eyesore. So going on the creepy factor, I guess the next thing to inevitably talk about is how the violence is handled and the gore is handled. Which is, depending on the kind of slasher fan you are, that might be another thing that you're kind of here for. So, what I like about the House on Sorority Row and about it having an old-fashioned feel is that when they actually do show the kills, it's very obviously, there's a lot of, like, a dummy stabbing going on here, where, like, obviously fake bodies are getting stabbed. And that's something that I kind of miss a little bit, where it's like, it was expected that movies like this would have low budget effects and stuff like that. So you could still get the effect, but it was still obvious that it was a dummy, but people had fun with it. And like I said, they just accepted it, and they accepted this sort of, what the effect looked like as is. And if it looked close enough, if it looked like, skin being ripped open or an eye popping out or something, you got the reaction. Nowadays, if you were to see something like that where you can still understand what's going on and appreciate the work put into it, but if it looks even a little bit fake, audiences are going to turn on you now. So that's something that's kind of a thing of the past that you kind of enjoy as a thing of the past, is being able to notice what the fakery is immediately. But the interesting thing about that is, apart from, we've got Liz getting her throat cut is pretty graphic. And there's the decapitation that we see the blood of, but we don't really see much of, like, anything else. Um, so apart from that, a lot of the kills in this are actually off screen. Where there's like the scene where like the arrows are coming down in the van, or when Stevie gets killed and we just see like her shadow and stuff like that. And it's like it's interesting how much they kind of went around gore when they could back at this particular time. We've talked many times before about how Halloween, barely has any blood in it at all, and how everything's sort of implied, or it's like we see just enough that we get what's going on. Or they do something really effective, like, pinning Bob to the wall or something, where it's a memorable kill, but they didn't need the gore aspect of it. And so to play with that, and there's even stuff like Morgan's death kind of has this sort of sadness to it, at least to me, where when she's playing with the Jack-in-the-Box, and she's like having this sort of happy moment, almost like it's taking her back. Like, I mean, first of all, it's like, who gets joy out of playing with a creepy Jack-in-the-Box, especially at night? But it's like it's like she went to this place like from her childhood or something, and she has this moment to herself, and then knowing it's like right before she's gonna get killed. I don't know. There's something about that moment. It's always just been kind of really sad to me. So that's something that you're not really gonna get with the remake, where it's kind of all about the gore and the violence and stuff like that. But I will say, as far as it being effective, I would say the kill scenes in the remake are effective in the sense, like, you have an actual visceral reaction to them, whether you want to or not. Because even though once it's all over, you can say, the killing scenes are just soulless, which is true, and there's nothing behind them because we don't give a shit about any of these characters. But like I said, you're never gonna have a moment where you feel sad in the way like that scene with Morgan is, where she has that one moment to herself. Here it's just the deaths, and oftentimes it's characters we're literally meeting for the first time, and so that's not gonna really do anything as far as like reacting in that way. But as far as us having a physical reaction to like the violence itself, just instinctually, there's definitely this sort of you can really feel the weight of that tire iron during these kill scenes, and there's something to that, whether it be maybe that's an ode to the sound, or I don't know what, but there's something to that where you have no choice but to have some sort of visceral reaction to these scenes. So there's maybe some merit to that, where you can physically feel the violence in the movie, whether that's unpleasant or not. They got the effect. But, like I said, when you compare it to you can get the same effect without really seeing much at all, it just kind of falls into excess. And this is what, obviously, slasher movies were by this time. Where, when I talked about, the two that come to mind from this same year as Sorority Row, or the Friday the 13th reboot and Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, and that's where you could tell we were really, by then, and we were in the post-torture porn area, so it was all about how violent and graphic your kills could be, and how bloody, and how much gore you could put into it, and that's basically what the idea was. And I think we kind of there was a certain group that kind of pretended to enjoy that, but I don't know in retrospect if anybody really looks back on this era with much fondness. And so, and the fact that it's just kind of this phase that the slasher genre went through, that it feels like we've we've gotten past it as far as like how much they leaned into it in this like late 2000s era. So, and it's like nowadays we seem to have more directors that are wanting to go back to the more old-fashioned route, to more like the movies like The House on Sorority Row. Which is nice, but like I said, for being in this era and for being like just soulless death scenes, there's a literal weight to them that sticks out. So it accomplishes that. As far as the endings go, as I talked about with that scene with House and Sorority, where we have this moment when he sits up and he's in the Jack-in-the-Box costume, that's basically the peak of the climax. Then it's just sort of your average, she's running away, they're kind of scuffling, And then you would think that we'd get the unkillable killer approach. And I know, and it could be really easy to get sick of that. Even though we were kind of, still relatively early in the, at least this portion of the slasher phase, that could have been tiring to have another movie where, oh, we think he's dead, he sits up, we get another climax, we think he's dead, we get another climax. It happens once where they have a scuffle, she seems to knock him out, or potentially kill him, and then his eyes open. And much to, I would imagine, the shock and surprise of modern audiences, it just fucking ends there. Um, like, it seems like it ends mid-climax, when you're used to the unkillable killer climax in a slasher movie. So, that's interesting, and I want to like it and admire it, but even with that in mind, I still think it's just kind of way too abrupt to have any real impact. Like I said, for like a modern audience that's used to what a slasher climax is, it's a genuine shock, but once that shock wears off, which is kind of quickly, it just kind of leaves you like, oh, that's what all of this was leading to, and so it feels less like it was the ending itself and the last shot itself that the whole thing was leading to. To get any sort of satisfaction out of the movie, you would have to think that what we were leading to was that moment when he sits up in the attic and we realize it's not a doll. Which, like I said, might be one of the greatest scenes in a horror movie ever, greatest reveals in a horror movie ever, a creepy moment. And that's basically our climatic moment. That's the best we're going to get. So it's something. I mean, it's still, like I said, it's still one of the great moments in horror movie history, but it's not like the ending or a last shot or anything, so we're still kind of left unsatisfied once everything that comes after that just kind of stops abruptly. So that's the way I've kind of taken that. As far as Sorority Row goes, the remake, I don't know. Okay, so it is. Death starts to become very casual for these characters, and like I said, I can't. These characters are just so nobody gives a fuck. They are not real people right away anyway. I don't know if it's just the characters being the characters. It's just these characters that are obsessed with getting their one-liners in, that are reacting so casually to death at this point, or if, because we are in the 2000s now, if the movie's trying to take some approach of self-awareness or self-parody or something on purpose. I don't... Because, and like, the only person that's not reacting casually to this is Rumor Willis, who's they basically designate this is the character that freaks out and has actual reactions. Everybody else just seems dead inside. So who cares if they, die outside? So, as far as that goes, if it's... The problem is like, if it's trying to be satire, it's not very good at it, is what's going on here. So it's like, there are moments where it's like, I can't tell if it's being self-aware or not, and usually that's the key to good satire, is if you have to question if it's satire or not, as long as that is the intention at the end of the day. But here, I don't... It's just so poorly made in general that I feel like there's no way anybody making this movie was smart enough to say, why don't we try to be self-aware? It feels like there was a very specific kind of movie going on, especially in 2009 in horror, where it was just about getting the visceral reactions from the audience, and nobody's was really putting that much thought behind it. Now, one 2009 movie that kind of broke through this was Jennifer's Body kind of resurfaced and found a new sort of meaning and following. And that was able to do that. I don't think Sorority Row is that kind of movie. Like I said, I feel like it was mainly just to get those visceral reactions from the audience, to give them the jump scares and all that, and then to send them on their way. I don't think this was made to be a thinking movie in any way whatsoever, so I'm not banking on any satire or intended satire or self-awareness being done here. It's just not very good, is what it is. And you even have like, talking about how it's not even well made. There's scenes where you can tell that would have stood out in a well-made movie. Like, I think it's Jamie Chung that gets killed in the bubbles, and it's like this scene where she's running through the bubbles, and you can't really see anything. There could be something there in a well-made movie, but it's just you can, like I said, you can only see what could have been a good way to utilize this. This movie doesn't find it. It just looks like it's just kind of set piece after set piece of. I could see where this scene could have worked with, a better director and just a better overall sense of suspense and, toying with the audience and stuff like that. But it's just about getting to that moment where the tire iron comes down, or somebody's killed in another way or whatever, and that's all it feels like it was really going towards. So there's just an absence of everything going on here. So yeah, I'm not like, as much as I love the slasher genre, House on Sorority Row is not one I ever really fell in love with, but I totally get its merits and its place in the slasher sort of lineup and the way they're viewed now. And so I remember when Randy references it in Scream 2 when he's talking about college-themed horror movies or college-themed slasher movies. And I think the first time I saw Scream 2, I think I thought that was a fake title. Because it's one of those things where it sounds like it would be, you could see the inspiration for like later B movies with stuff like this. Where, I mean, you could say, it's a B movie in itself. But the fact that I feel like it's reached enough of a status in slasher movie history that it does feel like it's kind of in that sort of, it was on the top row before everything started branching off into rip-offs. Even though, it does come off the back of like Halloween and Friday the 13th and stuff like that. It was made because it was easy to make at this time because of the popularity of slasher movies. But like I said, as far as like the quality of how it's made goes and how it used its budget, it does feel like that it's a little more upper tier than, like the very blatant rip-offs that came after the big slasher movies came out. So there's some sort of merit to it as far as slasher history goes. I feel like the remake's just kind of been forgotten, I feel like, and I feel like there's a reason for that. I would like to think this video is the first time in a long time you've been reminded that Sorority Row exists. But that's basically how I feel about these. So the next thing is, I don't know, I've shot so much lately. It might be a Stephen King thing. It might be something else. I don't know. But there's more, original versus remake stuff coming. There is another Stephen King thing coming, and we've got a themed week next week that I'm really excited about. So all of that and a bunch of other stuff all throughout October. So until the next thing, I think that's it.